Lord. We ask you to have your hand and healing providential word over them, Lord. We ask now that you be with Seth as he delivers a message. The great things that he did. May you open our hearts and open our ears that we might be able to make a practical application of his life into ours. Lord, we ask you to be with Seth. May his mind be clear and full of wisdom. It's all in Jesus' name I pray this morning. Amen.
Amen. Wednesday night, I mentioned that that was the last lesson in the fourth part of this study, the Sermon on the Mount portion. And this morning we begin the next part called Jesus' Busy Day. And we're going to primarily be in Luke chapter 7 this morning. We've been in Matthew for a long time. And Matthew does cover this account, same narrative, but we're going to use Luke's and then use Matthew's as a reference instead of the other way around. So Matthew 8 or Luke 7, either one will be a good place to be. We'll look at some differences between the two in just a second. But Jesus has just completed the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 8, verse 1, when he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. So in Matthew 5, 1, Jesus goes up onto the mountain, and then in Matthew 8, 1, Jesus comes down from the mountain. And from this point forward, Jesus is going to be surrounded by people, crowds of people, thronging around him. Everywhere he went, for the most part, people would be swarming around him and seeking things from him. And sometimes those things varied depending on the situation and who it was. Luke 7 gives us 4 great examples of how much Jesus cares about you. And that's the focus of this lesson. We're going to look at the first 3 of these 4 examples in Luke 7. We have to remember but the purpose of Jesus' miracles. Jesus performed miracles not to simply wow people, but he had a reason. And one of the things that his miracles did was revealed his identity. That was a big thing. Another part of that, though, maybe a side effect, I say, for lack of a better word, was it showed his compassion also, Jesus' compassion. He had compassion on people. And it's a very impactful study and thing to consider how many times you can read in the gospel accounts that Jesus saw something and he was moved with compassion. That not everybody is like that. We could all be a little bit more like that. That we see something is all it takes. We see somebody, see something. And we're moved with compassion because of what we see. Now, Matthew 8 talks about 2 of these 4 things, but doesn't cover all 4 of them. So that's one reason we're going to use Matthew as a reference instead of the primary text. So let's look at these accounts. Learn how much Jesus cares. And if you don't take anything else from this study, those 2 words will be enough. The mustard seed for you to take home is Jesus cares. Starting in Luke 7, verse 1, this is about a centurion and his servant. This is what the text says. After he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of all the people, or in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue. And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you. But say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, Go, and he goes, and to another, Come, and he comes. And to my servant, Do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. Okay, so where are we? We're at Capernaum. That's the stage. That's the setting of this event. Capernaum. That was Jesus' home base now, his headquarters. He was from Nazareth. He was born in Bethlehem. He lived in Nazareth, grew up in Nazareth, but now he chooses Capernaum as his home base, more or less. What is a centurion? That's really a huge part. Not really a huge part, but if you don't know what a centurion is, it may be confusing to go any further because what is this? I don't even know what that is. Well, a centurion was a Roman official, Roman officer who had command of about 100 men. Centurion, that's why he's called a centurion. That prefix meaning 100 or something like that. That's who we're dealing with here, a Roman. He was not, the text does not indicate that he was a Jewish proselyte, a proselyte of righteousness, they called him, like the Ethiopian eunuch obviously was in Acts chapter 8. This man clearly was not, but he was simply a Gentile. A Gentile. And that is a big part of this. Some of the lessons that we'll learn from this account. So what ended up happening? Well, we just read. He had a servant that was sick, about to die. A servant he loved very much, very valued by him. And we learn a little bit about this particular centurion in the message or what the envoys said about him. First of all, they said, He is worthy to have you do this for him. Well, why did they say that? Well, first of all, who were the messengers? I think I heard somebody say it. Elders, yeah. What kind of elders? Jewish elders. Elders of the Jews. Now, isn't that interesting? A centurion, a Roman centurion, is sending elders of the Jews to Jesus on his behalf. Why do you think he did that? Because, Jesus was a Jew. He knew Jesus. He knew who Jesus was, what Jesus was. And he knew who he was, and he knew what the Jews thought about him, even though their opinions about Gentiles in general, as a rule, were not fair, really. He understood that that's the way the Jews looked at it, and he was of such a humble spirit, as we learned from this, that he didn't take offense to that, but he wanted the best possible. He wanted to do this, approach Jesus in the best possible manner so as to bring about the most effective and profitable result. So he sends elders of the Jews, and they told Jesus he's worthy. Why? He's worthy to have Jesus do what they're going to ask, or what they've asked. Okay. He likes the Jews. If I can paraphrase, that's pretty much he's worthy because he loves our nation, and he even built us a synagogue. How did he do that? No clue. Did he just, lobby for it and work really hard to have it built? Or in what way did this centurion, depending on how large the Roman army was, and I have a feeling it was pretty large, being a commander or captain of 100 men or so isn't that high of a position necessarily. But he apparently somehow went about getting a synagogue built there at Capernaum. If I'm not mistaken, one of the synagogues of antiquity is still, it's been uncovered over there in Capernaum. I'm pretty sure it's in Capernaum. Was it this one? I don't know. Maybe not. But they said, he is worthy to have you do this. Now, how did Jesus respond? He went with them. That's all. That was enough for him to go. But then he's approaching the house. He's getting nearer to the house. It seems that his house wasn't in Capernaum itself, but maybe right outside of Capernaum. One scholar said it may be on the road to Tiberias from Capernaum, be a reasonable place that he may have lived. But at any rate, Jesus approaches his house, and then he sends more messengers out. This time he sends his friends, presumably people that were in the house with him. And then they have a message from the centurion for Jesus. And the message was this: Lord, do not trouble yourself. Well, what's that supposed to mean? You mean Jesus came all this way, and now he's saying, never mind? Well, what he means is explained in the next part of the rest of what he says. He says, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. So what did he mean when he said, don't trouble yourself? You don't have to come any further. He didn't mean don't trouble yourself to heal my servant, but don't trouble yourself to come into my house, because I'm not worthy for you to come into my house. Therefore, he says, and I'm not incredibly fond of the ESV in verse 7, but some of the other versions say, therefore I did not judge myself worthy to come to you. Now, in verse 6, the message was, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. It's interesting that, especially in the versions that say what I just said they say, I did not judge myself worthy. Same English word, but he uses two different words in the original language. One of them has been said to have reference to Levitical worthiness or Judaistic worthiness or fitness. And the other word in verse 7 has reference to spiritual or moral worthiness. And I think it's interesting, at least, that in the one case, he says, I am not worthy, as if it's a fact. Because Levitically, what would the rabbis say about a Gentile's house? Unclean, and guess what happens if you go in it? You're unclean. So guess how many Jews went into Gentiles' houses? Not very many. Now, considering that, isn't it interesting that Jesus was about to march right in there? That is a point that we shouldn't overlook. Jesus did not share the unfounded views of some of his peers. The law did not say strictly, as simple as they claimed, that a Gentile's house actually made you unclean and defiled if you entered it. At least in the way that the Pharisees and the other Jews claimed. And they said the same thing about anything to do with the Gentile. Gentile, if you're dying of thirst and a Gentile gives you water and it comes from their cup, you better not drink out of that cup, because then the water's defiled and you're defiled if you drink it, and it's just a never-ending vortex of puffed up arrogance and over-exaggeration. Straining out the gnat and swallowing the camel, to put it in Jesus' words. So he says, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Again, understanding the Jews' views of Gentiles. But, therefore, I did not presume, or I did not consider myself or judge myself worthy to come to you. See, in that case, that's his own estimation of himself. The first time, he says that as a fact. This time, he says, this is how he presents it as his own estimation of himself. I did not judge myself to be worthy to come to you. But if you'll just say the word, my servant will be healed. For I too am a man set under authority. Now, what in the world does this have to do with anything? Is he bragging? You know, that's what I used to think it sounded like. If you just read verse 8, it's what it sounds like, doesn't it? I'm a man of authority, and if I tell somebody to go, guess what he does? He goes. And if I tell him to come here, guess what? He comes right here. And if I tell him to go do that, guess what he does? He does that. He doesn't do anything else. Doesn't that make me special? Do you think that's what he's trying to do? Or what do you think his point is? Yeah, Wayne?
Well, the key to me is when he says, I too, he recognizes the authority Jesus has because he knows what authority he has.
Yeah. And based on what he just said in verse 7, what authority specifically in this case is he implying that Jesus has? Yeah. Say the word, what word? Whatever word he's going to say to command whatever illness or sickness his servant has, and it'll go away. So he's saying, I understand the concept of authority because the soldier's under me. When I tell a soldier to go, he goes. And whenever I tell him to come, he comes. And whenever I tell him to do this, he does it. And he's implying that he knows that Jesus could say to a sickness to go, and it'll go. Isn't that something? That'd be a nice skill to have. But he is implying that Jesus has this ability. So he says, say the word and just let my servant be healed. You don't even have to come any closer. All you have to do is say the word. And when Jesus heard these things, it says he marveled at him. It's one of those times when Jesus is said to experience an emotion, for lack of a better word, that implies surprise, doesn't it? How else can you marvel at something? You ever marveled at something before? Now, have you ever marveled at something that you already knew was going to happen? Or that you already knew anyway? Probably not, unless you forgot, in which case you sort of didn't know. But Jesus didn't go around knowing every single thing about every single person that ever lived all the time. But he was able to be surprised like this. He marveled at this man. And then he turned and said something to the people. He didn't say it to him, he said it to the people. Again, the master teacher always knew how to teach. He uses this as a teaching opportunity. He says, I haven't seen this kind of faith even in Israel. Why did he specify Israel? He could have just, isn't it the same statement to say, I have not yet found such faith as this man has just shown.
They were supposed to be his people, strictly.
Yeah.
The fact that a Gentile would have more faith than even anybody of his own tribe speaks to.
Yes. He deliberately mentions Israel here as a lesson to the people. Guess who those crowds were? They were Israelites. And he lets them know, even in Israel, I have not found this kind of faith that this man has. And guess who this man is? He's a dirty, unclean, nasty, heathen, pagan, idol-worshiping, king-worshiping Gentile. Only he wasn't, was he? Other than the last part, he was a Gentile. But he was an example to them that even a Gentile like this, and not just any Gentile, but a Roman soldier, can have more faith, and does in this case have more faith, and an appropriate kind of faith, even than the Israelites have. One of the prophets in a messianic declaration that we sometimes use for Jesus' second coming, referring to the Messiah when he came. He said, when he comes, will he find faith on the earth? You've probably heard that before. When he comes, will he find faith on the earth? Well, Jesus has pretty much just said, as he has now come, he hasn't found faith in Israel. Not like this. But yet a Gentile showed him the kind of faith that he would prefer, and ideally all the Israelites would have, but they don't have it and he does. And therefore, whenever he honored the centurion's both of his requests, not only for the healing, but for not coming any farther or not coming into his house. And when they went back to the house, the servant was well. Wasn't sick anymore. Now, if you remember an earlier account, when a man's son, I guess it was sick and almost to the point of death, he goes to Jesus. Jesus says he'll be made well. And then his people came to meet him halfway there or somewhere along the road, and he worked out when he started to get better, and he figured out it was right when Jesus spoke. In this case, it seems the men were not very far from the house. So they came out and told Jesus, don't worry, you don't have to come in. I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. Then they turned around and went back home, and he was already better right then. Boom. They didn't have to work anything out, but when they walked out, he was sick, about to die. And when they walked in, he was all better. All better. And we get the impression he had been sick for a long time, relatively speaking at least. They walk back into the house, there he is well. Now, got to point out a couple of things. There are differences, at least one key difference in the way Matthew and Luke tell this story. Matthew seems to suggest, and I emphasize the word seems, that the centurion goes to Jesus himself directly. He leaves out the messengers, the envoys. That's all. He cuts out the middleman, whereas Luke doesn't cut out the middleman. That's the only difference. Now, some would say that is a contradiction. Matthew says the centurion went straight to Jesus. The centurion went and said this to Jesus, and that Jesus said to him. Let's see. When he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, and so on and so forth, like that. Now, if you approach somebody with a messenger between the two of you, is it still you speaking to them? What do you think?
You tell them what to say.
Yeah, if you told them what to say and they go to them and tell them, that's still you saying that. That's not his words, are they? That's your words being spoken through this person. Just like if you have a language barrier and you're talking to an interpreter and they interpret it, the interpreter is all but not even really a part of the conversation because they're just sending the message. So there is no contradiction here. What Matthew says is strictly true, even if he did it by means of mediators, messengers, envoys. And so there is no real discrepancy here. In both accounts, he's speaking to Jesus and Jesus is speaking to him. Matthew simply doesn't specify how he spoke to Jesus, while Luke does. The remarkable thing about this difference, though, is that they seem to be opposite of what we would expect. And we may not think of this naturally or on the surface as I wouldn't have. But the Jewish gospel, which is Matthew, Matthew was a Jew and he was writing to Jews, gives the pro-Gentile view presentation, and the Gentile narrative, Luke, who was a Gentile, the only Gentile writer of the Bible as far as we know, he gives the pro-Jewish presentation of the narrative. So in Matthew, he presents this Gentile as seems to present him as coming directly and personally to Jesus, and Jesus dealing with him directly, whereas Luke by the intervention of Jews. Very interesting. Matthew gives a quote of Jesus which sort of calls out the faith of the Gentiles as being equal or even greater. I would take it as being greater. I don't see any equality whatsoever. And he puts aside the claim of Israel after the flesh, their claim of being, we're Abraham's seed and therefore we're special. He throws that aside. Jesus through Matthew throws aside that notion. And also throws in there the doom of Israel to judgment. Luke omits all that. Matthew argues with his countrymen for the real standing of the Gentiles in God's eyes, whereas Luke pleads with the Gentiles for sympathy and love for the Jewish ways of thinking through the centurion's humility and understanding of the way the Jews looked at them and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting the differences, as small as they are. There's also a lot there that is just interesting to think about with the way Luke, the Gentile writer, presents it, this occasion between Jesus and a Gentile, and the way Matthew, the Jewish writer, to a Jewish audience, presents. And Luke is writing to a Greek audience or a Gentile audience. So, why did Jesus say, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith? What attitudes or actions did the centurion show that would lead Jesus to make such a claim? What do you think? All right, humility, that was a big one. And even if we wouldn't say that humility was the thing, it at least was one of the things that led to him being the way that he was and doing the things that he did, for sure. Humility, or a lack thereof, has a huge effect on our actions. Yes, sir.
It's strange that the centurion knew the power of Christ when his own people did not.
Isn't it? Yeah.
And did not. It's pretty amazing that the Israelite nation knew that Christ was coming, and his example, his healings and everything should have told them that this is who I am, this is who you've been reading about for centuries. Here I am, but you still don't believe.
Yeah. And he used this as an opportunity to make that point once again that, hey, in Israel, how come Israel doesn't have the faith of this man? How come this man has more faith than Israel does? That should not be the case. That should not happen. The Gentiles, at best, were centuries behind the Jews as far as their awareness and knowledge of the one true God. It should never be that, and especially of looking for the Messiah, so the Jews should always have been more faithful. And there was a remnant of the Jews that were. Who do you think Jesus' disciples were? and some of the other people that would have followed him and stayed with him, kept following him. So, yeah, there is a powerful lesson here that Israel, as Paul would later explain, Israel, who had the foreknowledge, so to speak, and who had the prophets and the law, and who had all these blessings and promises, did not reach the faith, the righteousness of God, because they did it by their own works. They were trying to do it. Whereas the Gentiles, who didn't have all those great blessings, who didn't have those promises delivered to them directly, and who did not have the prophets and all these other things, did reach the righteousness of God because they sought it by faith. Yes, sir.
One more point. It says that Jesus marveled, as if it caught him by surprise that the centurion would have this type of faith.
Mm-hmm.
His confidence in him.
Yeah, he obviously hadn't came across it before. And the fact that it was this Roman soldier, of all people. Very, very powerful point. And Jesus did not ever try to dodge an opportunity to elevate Gentiles over the Jews. He made this point in other times too, and they did not like it very much. They were very angry. Some of the Pharisees and other in the Jewish establishment, when he made the point that, hey, guess how many Israelite widows God sent Elisha or Elijah to help? Zero. But he did send them over to outside of Israel, and you can imagine how they responded to that. Didn't like it one bit. But it was true. It was a fact that God did that, and they knew it. They knew that it was in their scriptures, but they just did not like the application that had along with it. Trying to get them to see that fleshly Israel is worthless. Even Paul said, a Jew is not a Jew outwardly. A Jew is not one who is a Jew outwardly, but a Jew inwardly. In other words, just because you've been physically circumcised and you are physically of the blood of Abraham, or you can trace your lineage back to some Israelite, doesn't mean anything as far as your stance with God. But it's in here, circumcision of the heart. And this man showed that. This centurion showed. This uncircumcised heathen showed himself to be more of a Jew, to use it the way Paul did, than the Jews themselves. He was circumcised in heart. Just like Stephen called the Jews uncircumcised in heart and ears, for that matter. And we all know what they did to him after he said that. No humility, no repentance. Just read this quote to answer this question. In his self-acknowledged unfitness lay the real fitness of this good soldier for membership with the true Israel. In his deep-felt unworthiness, the real worthiness for the kingdom and its blessings. He goes on to say, here was one who was in the state described in the first clauses of the Beatitudes, and to whom came the promise of the second clause. We just got done studying the Sermon on the Mount. Think about all those Beatitudes. You can see them in this man. Pure in heart, poor in spirit, meek, merciful even. Hungering and thirsting after righteousness, we can only assume, based on his character. So maybe the deepest lesson here is that participation in the kingdom of Christ is not connected with any outward relationship towards that kingdom, and not even necessarily to the inward consciousness of that kingdom, but is granted by the king of that kingdom to the kind of faith that this man had, which shows itself in obedience, ultimately. Some quick points. Yeah, go ahead.
The ruling class didn't want to give up their power. That's what it amounted to.
Yeah.
They wanted to have all the control.
They weren't willing to accept anything that would imply or lead to them having to give up that power. Even no matter what proof was shown to them, they would not. They grasped that greedily and pridefully, and would not give that up. And some of them that didn't even have any power grasped on to what they perceived to be something that elevated them over other people, like being Abraham's seed, or same spirit and same mentality, just different thing they were grasping. So we notice how that Jesus stopped what he was doing to go to this centurion's home. That's not why he was here. He wasn't at Capernaum for this to happen. He stopped what he was doing to go there. We notice the centurion's attitude, not feeling worthy, and we notice the centurion's faith. Our main point here, though, is that Jesus cares about the sick. Jesus cares. Yes, sir.
One more point. I can't help but think that reading through the Old Testament and how they're supposed to treat strangers and foreigners and things like that. They were supposed to be the example of the world, of Christ, God living in them. But it turned out that they thought, well, the Gentiles, you're dogs.
Yeah.
And it's really against what God was wanting them to project as a Christian or a godly society. So, and this didn't help matters.
Yeah. And
Everybody around them. So.
most people, including myself, if we're in a place, let's not kid ourselves, there are many places in the world today that do not look favorably on America or Americans, for that matter. And if you are in a place where you know they hate Americans simply because of what they are and what America is, that will probably harden you against those people, won't it? You will not be comfortable, at least, and you will sort of have a sort of, animus about you towards those people, because out of defensiveness and, self-reflection in that way. So think about being a Gentile who knows the way the Jews view Gentiles. You going to like the Jews? Probably not. But look at this man. So far from not liking the Jews, he loved the Jews. He loves our nation, they said. He helped them build their synagogue in Capernaum. He was obviously acquainted with and respectful and reverent of Israel's God, and so on and so forth. That shows so much of his character, almost more than anything else that happens in this narrative. Just that fact alone shows so much about him, that he was able, in humility and self-denial, to overlook that unjust view of the Jews on Gentiles and look beyond that. And that's a similar thing that happened later on with this woman that Jesus sort of tested by saying, shouldn't take from the table and give it the children's food and give it to the dogs. He said that to a woman, and she understood exactly what the implication was. Of course, Jesus was doing this to test her, and when she responded in a humble and meek way, like this centurion, said, even the dogs get the crumbs, scraps or crumbs, that led him to do the same thing as he did here, and he marveled at that woman. That reaction coming from her blew him away. She could have spat at him or slapped him in the face or so many other things, but the way she reacted to that, he said, this is a faith, again, that is very rare, and coming from this woman of all people. Well, the next story, same general lesson and application, but Jesus is going to raise a widow's son from the dead. Verse 11 says, soon afterward he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. So he's going from Capernaum to Nain, and now he's still got this huge mass of people following him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, do not weep. Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people. And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. Here's that statement. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. But he didn't just have compassion on her like most of us would if we see a widow who's just lost her only son. So she had only one son, and the language seems to indicate that was the only son she ever had. Not that she's used to have more children or anything like that, but this was the only child she ever had. And her husband, the father of that boy or young man, whatever he was dead. And now he has died. Almost all of us, if we walk into a town and see that woman in her state of mourning, are going to have compassion or pity. But not necessarily the way Jesus did. He had compassion to the point that he was going to do something. And what he said to her might catch us by surprise. It's not, a lot of us say things that are probably not what needs to be said in a time to somebody who's mourning. We have the best intentions, and I'm not saying Jesus did that, but I'm saying we can relate to that idea, and we might see that this is one of those times, which it wasn't. But we say things that maybe are not necessarily helpful, even though we meant them well. Sometimes the best thing to say is nothing. Being there is good. Think about Job with his 3 friends. Job suffering, his 3 friends show up, and They sat with him for days, didn't say anything. And as soon as they opened their mouth is when all the trouble started. Better when they just sat with him than when they started talking. But Jesus had a reason to say what he said. He walked up to this widow who's just lost her only son and told her not to cry. Stop crying. But then he walked up to the bier that the men were holding that had the boy or the young man on it, and he touched it. Didn't touch the person. He touched the thing he was on. And when he did, the bearers, pallbearers we would call them, they stopped walking. He didn't say anything yet. They just stopped. Why'd they stop? I have no clue. It's one of those things I wish I could see how this happened, how this played out. He walks up, touches the thing, and they just stop for no apparent reason. And he said something to the dead man. He said, "Get up." And the dead man got up and started speaking. And then Jesus presented him alive to his mother, his grieving mother. But the most moving thing about all this whole account is, again, verse 13. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. This statement is unique to Luke's account. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. This phrase, I should say, not his account, but this whole phrase in general, with one exception. But the Lord, Luke calls him the Lord, saw her. He had compassion on her. The gospel writers hardly ever call Jesus the Lord in the gospels, but Luke does. And other than Mark 16, 19, and 20, it's the only time outside of Luke when that phrase is used of Jesus, the Lord. He had compassion, and he did something. Jesus cares when death tears us apart. And finally, before we run out of time, John the Baptist. Where in the world is John the Baptist anyway? Where's he been? He has really been missing in action for quite a while, in our study at least, in the life of Christ. Where is he? Well, he is in prison. You know what's interesting is we didn't even know he was thrown in prison until he's about to be killed. And then the writers tell us the story about why he's in prison in the first place. That's where John has been. He's been there for several months. Matthew 14 and Mark 6, Herod had thrown him in prison several months earlier by the time they're telling us about it. John hears about all these things that are going on, and he sends some of his disciples to Jesus with a question. Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? It's one of the most shocking things to consider coming out of John's mouth. But we can sympathize with him, I think, in his circumstances. He had a moment. You ever had a moment before? You know what kind of moment I'm talking about. He had a moment. Lucky for him, thankfully for him, it was just a moment. Sometimes for us, it's a moment that spans a long period of time. He had a moment, but Jesus was even compassionate with him. He gives a response, and his response was not only assuring John, but he also really builds up John. I mean, he says some pretty strong things about John. Whenever you tell people that there's never been a man who's born of woman that's greater than fill in the blank, that's pretty high praise, I would say. You know how many men have been born of woman? Every one of them except one. Adam. So Jesus is saying, There's never been. He didn't mean Adam was greater than him. He's saying John is greater than any other man that's ever walked the earth. And yet he says, the one who is least in the kingdom of God is greater even than John. So he assures John, but he vindicates John. He's compassionate for John, doesn't rebuke him, doesn't tell him, are you kidding me, John, after all this time? You're the one who was telling people from the start that I'm the Son of God, and now you're doing this? You ought to be ashamed of yourself. If Herod hadn't already thrown you in prison, I would do it for him right now. He didn't do any of that. He reassured him, said, just tell John all the things you've seen and heard. The deaf, the lame walk, the blind receive their sight, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them. Jesus cares even when doubt clouds our minds. So recognizing this care that Jesus has for me, for you, how much more should we live for Him? Should lead us to a stronger sense of obligation and obedience. Thoughts, comments? Okay, thank you very much.